My name's Rebecca Miller, and I'll be the moderator of today's panel. I'm a PhD candidate in Environment and Resources here at Stanford, and my research covers how communities and governments in California prepare for, respond to, and recover from wildfires. Here at the Bill Lane Center for the American West, we had originally intended to have an in-person workshop on wildfire management as the culmination of a Stanford course on environmental governance and climate resilience, co-taught by Professor Bruce Kane, the director of the Bill Lane Center, and Professor Len Ortolano. Students in the course delved into complex wildfire issues like insurance, utilities, evacuation planning, and emergency operations. The workshop was originally scheduled for mid-March and centered on the challenges of responding to wildfires in Santa Clara and San Mateo counties. Dr. Sarah McCaffrey, our speaker today, was originally scheduled as a keynote speaker for our workshop, which was canceled due to the coronavirus outbreak. We're delighted that she can be with us remotely today. Dr. McCaffrey joins us from the US Forest Service, where she is a research forester at the Rocky Mountain Research Station. She earned her bachelor's degree here at Stanford and a PhD in wildland resource science at UC Berkeley. With more than 100 articles exploring how and why homeowners and other stakeholders prepare for wildfires, Dr. McCaffrey brings extraordinary experience and research to our conversation. Her current research focuses on broader social pieces of the fire management system, including how stakeholders conceive of becoming a fire-adapted community and barriers to increased use of fire as a management tool, both prescribed fire and managing wildfires for resource benefits. In addition, she's begun working with a colleague to explore how social media can provide insights into various aspects of fire management, including whether tweets related to wildfire smoke can serve as reasonable proxy for air quality, and how media portrayal of fire management varies over time and between countries, looking at the United States, Canada, and Australia. Dr. McCaffrey's research focuses on understanding a wide range of the social aspects of fire management. A particular emphasis of her research is working with managers to identify areas where existing research could provide insight, as well as where more research is needed, and synthesizing and communicating relevant research findings. Today, Dr. McCaffrey will highlight aspects of US Forest Service research that examine wildfire risk perceptions, incentives for creation and maintenance of defensible space, and key factors to consider in preparing for wildfire given the double threats of wildfires and COVID-19. We're delighted to welcome her today. At this point, I'm going to pass it off to Sarah for her to start on her presentation. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, I am delighted to be here. I wish I would be even more delighted to be in person. I was really looking forward to getting back to my old stomping grounds and seeing just how many new buildings there are on campus. But I'm delighted to have this opportunity to talk to you now. I have taken the presentation I was going to give in March, and it's pretty much a very similar presentation, but I've tried to adapt and add in a few things related to COVID. So this is not going to be focused on COVID, but I have tried to identify where there's some parallels in thinking and research that might help people think about how COVID might apply in the wildfire context right now. So I'm going to cover two kind of proposed solutions to the social side of the wildfire problem. I have a friend who I sort of said, what are the solutions that get proposed that are really generic and kind of problematic? And she gave me four, and I'm going to talk about two of them that are sort of the social side. Homeowners just need to be aware of their risk, so they'll fix their mess. And then the wildland-urban interface planning will solve all of our problems. I'm going to focus mostly on the first one because that's where most of the research is. But it's worth kind of noting that both of these are kind of like externalizing the solution. It's like the solution is those people or that group out there, which I think is something to think about. And what I'm pulling from, particularly for the first part, is a lot of research that's been happening in fire social science. So my dissertation was actually looking at homeowners in defensible space and public acceptance of prescribed fire in Incline Village, Nevada in the late 1990s. And since then, I and a number of other research with the Forest Service and universities across the United States have done quite a number of studies looking at these topics. And so this is a synthesis of what we found at 2010. And I did a follow-up smaller synthesis in 2015. Basically, the findings reinforced all of what we found in 2010 with more nuance and sort of additional things. But the thing that was interesting in the 2015 is that then we started seeing a lot more research coming outside of the US, particularly from Australia, but also Canada and New Zealand. And what was really fascinating is how similar the findings were across the countries in terms of the key dynamics that I'm going to be talking about. And it also showed that the key dynamics are relevant across the temporal gradient. A lot of the research out of Australia looks at the during fire and recovery issues, and you see the exact same dynamics are critical, irrelevant of whether you're talking about before, during, or after a fire. So this is kind of my big takeaway. Beware the imagined public. We make a lot of statements about the public and which part of the public is the problem and what they think and why they think it and who thinks what. And the thing is with this imagined public is the empirical research doesn't support it. Now I've said doesn't support most of the narratives. I could say it doesn't support all, but it doesn't support any except for one. And that's one where we give them good reason to believe it. And so the interesting thing is, like my dissertation in 1998 basically found similar thing, that it didn't support the narratives. And yet you still hear the narratives, despite all this research that sort of says, what you're saying isn't true. So the question that's interesting is, why do these narratives stick? And there's a number of items, but two that I think are useful to think about is sampling. All right, so sampling bias. What is sampling bias? So sampling bias is when you take a non-representative sample and you equate it to be representative of the entire population. So what I have seen quite often is fire managers take the people who come and yell at them, we don't like what you're doing, we don't like the smoke from the prescribed burning, and they equate that to everybody. And the problem with that is that probably the people you're hearing from are the people who are unhappy with what you're doing, and the people who already know or are just going about doing it, they're not coming in asking questions. So the data really doesn't support those outliers that we are basing our narrative on. And then the other one is confirmation bias. And so confirmation bias is something all humans do. We've been hearing a lot about it in recent years as we talk about how people interpret information that they get. And so confirmation bias is something we do to sort of simplify when we're getting a lot of information into the system. And so what that means is we sort of, once we form an opinion about something, we tend to discount information that contradicts that opinion and give a lot more credence to information that supports it. So if you think nobody has defensible space, you'll drive through a community and you'll notice every single house that doesn't have defensible space. And you may not actually just even see the houses that are good. So we're sort of picking and choosing our facts to fit fit the narrative that we have. And then the other thing about narratives that it's worth thinking about is that narratives serve a function, and the solution you come up with will reflect the narrative that you use to create the problem. And so sometimes we stick with a narrative because it leads to a solution that we like, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. So I'm going to go through a couple of these narratives and what the narrative is and what the data says. Individuals don't understand the fire risk, so clearly that's a premise of that first sort of solution. And the reality is the vast majority of people know they live in high fire risk areas. But the thing is, risk is complex and really subjective. We tend to treat risk as if it's this nice, clean, linear thing where it's easy to calculate, and once we all agree on it, we'll all act. And risk is so much more complex and subjective than that. And I'm going to go over a couple ways that's the case. So at a very simple and the cleanest level, risk is probability times consequences. But even there, that gets complicated because probability depends on the time frame and the spatial extent you're considering. So two people might be thinking of a completely different time frame and spatial extent. Homeowner is the chances my house will burn down this summer, and a firefighter might be the chance in the next 2 years I'm going to be on a fire where homes are threatened. So two different time frames, two different spatial extents, and two different consequences. One is a very specific consequence, my home burning down, and the other is homes will be threatened. So you might both be talking about fire risk, but you're fundamentally talking about a different risk. And that's, I think, part of the issue is sometimes we're not talking about the same risk. So even at that level, risk is complicated, but it gets even more complicated. So one of the other things that researchers have done in the natural hazards field is kind of look at why do people respond differently to different risks. And so they've identified a bunch of qualitative factors that are associated with different risks, and to see why are there some risks where we respond really strongly and we don't tolerate them, even though actually the probability of something bad happening is not high. And they've identified kind of two factors, and one is unknown risk. So the more a risk is known, the less likely we're going to feel strongly about reacting to that risk. And the more likely we're probably acceptable risk might be a little bit higher. So with fire, it's voluntary by and large, our exposure to it. We choose to live out in the woods. The immediacy of effect, you know, if there's a fire right away, it's there, it's happening. Everybody has experience with fire, if they live there or if they're just a gas stove at home. There's a lot of scientific knowledge about fire. There's 50 to 60 years of research on fire behavior and fire ecology, and we're now getting 20 years of research related to fire social science, so pretty good scientific understanding. Perceived control, well, that's what suppression's all about, and we think we're really good at it, and we are most of the time. 97% of the time we do control the fires. And then it's not new. It's something that's been around for a long time. We're very familiar with it, and so none of that is threatening to us. So that means fire does not rate terribly highly on unknown risk. Now, as I've been going through this, I'm guessing or hoping you've also been kind of thinking about COVID. And you can sort of see how, in that sense, COVID is very much an unknown risk and ticks all of these boxes in sort of the way that means we're going to respond very strongly to this particular risk. It is new, it's involuntary, we don't know much about it. And the key thing there, why we respond, one of the key dynamics why we respond to that risk much more strongly is all of those things about we don't know how immediate its effect, we don't have much knowledge, that's all about uncertainty. It's high uncertainty levels, and humans really hate uncertainty. And so we will go to a lot of lengths and a lot of different things to try to decrease that uncertainty. So that's kind of a first starting point for thinking about where does wildfire fit into this equation of people are already faced with a lot of uncertainty in their lives and their world at this moment in time. So trying to sort of create more uncertainty with wildfire is probably going to be counterproductive. The other one is dread risk. A number of people killed, fortunately, with fire. Until recent years, we have not tended to lose a lot of people to fires. Dread potential is kind of like just how scary and intimidating. And when you have a fire on your doorstep, it's very dread, but most of the time it's not. And the consequences can be extremely severe, but they're very limited. It's, you know, the houses in a neighborhood or just one specific area. Whereas again, COVID rates really high on all of these things. And that just sort of means that we're going to respond much stronger as a society in terms of that risk. And this is more looking at aggregate sort of response, but there's indication that these qualitative factors also influence how individuals respond to risk. But there's a lot of other individual factors that shape how they respond to risk. And a couple of those are, in terms of low probability events, those are pretty hard for people to sort of understand and assess. And so we tend to use what's called the availability heuristic, which is, and a heuristic just means a rule of thumb, basically. And that is, we estimate the likelihood based on the ease we can imagine or recall a past event. Now that's kind of a challenge with COVID. But so we use things like the flu, or we're using the Spanish flu. So one of the sort of estimates we're using a lot lately that I keep hearing is this idea of a second wave. And I keep kind of wondering, second wave, what's the evidence that we won't just have a continual wave? You know, so we're sort of, this assumption is based on that availability heuristic that we've used in the past. For low probability events, when it's a highly salient event, something that people are kind of really relevant to them, we do tend to overestimate the risk and the probability. And then there's a tendency towards two extremes in response. Either it will happen to me or it won't happen to me. And I think we've all been seeing that with COVID, with people who are actually fairly low risk, you know, in their 30s with no comorbidities of asthma or anything, who will not leave their house, and people who are in their 60s and 70s and might have diabetes or a health issue, and they're happy to go out and about and not do anything because it won't happen to me. So you can sort of see how a lot of these dynamics are playing out now. The other thing that comes into play is affect or emotion. Those can play a really important role in the decision process, not just the risk. And they're really important when we face decision trade-offs that are difficult, or there's ambiguity in terms of what is the right action. So with fire and evacuation, that's a very good example. So, there's ambiguity of what's the right action. Leaving early is the best thing you can do to save your life. But if you stick around, you might be able to do some things to protect your house and decrease the chance it might catch on fire. So you see people who are really, their emotional response is just pure fear. I want out of here, and they're going to leave early. And you might have somebody else whose emotional response is, oh my God, we can't afford to lose our home. We don't have insurance maybe. And in which case they're going to act on that signal, which is to maybe wait to evacuate and see what they can do to protect their house. And I think we're seeing some of the same kind of affect and strongest and ambiguity on right action play out now with COVID. Okay, so individuals so we sort of established that we'll respond to different risks differently based on the qualitative. But even if we agree on the same risk and we sort of agree that we've calculated the same, you'll still have individuals respond to it differently. And the actual decision to mitigate or support the practice will depend on other factors, such as the trade-offs with the benefits. So all of our risk exposure tends to have something else that's beneficial to us. And so, the more you benefit from exposure to the risk, the more you tolerate that risk, or the higher the acceptable risk you'll take. So people who live out in the woods, they get a lot of benefit for that risk exposure. I get to see nature, it's private, it's where I can afford to own property. And particularly if it's a voluntary risk exposure, then we tend to have even higher tolerance for risk levels because it's a choice. Risk attitude also comes into play. So even with the same risk, two people might respond to it very differently, because some people are really risk tolerant and they like to jump out of planes with and parachutes or off buildings with squirrel suits, and other people think that's insane. And so that shapes how we respond to a particular risk. So with fire, we've seen that there's evidence that people who live out in the woods, they get the risk and they're comfortable with it. And some people are like, oh, there's no way I would live out there. That's way too scary. That's why we live in town. So that's shaping their choice of where to live. And with evacuation, we've also seen that people who are really risk tolerant, they are more likely to stay and defend their home. Whereas people who are financially risk tolerant, like I can afford to lose my home, they tend to leave early. So that shapes how we respond to things. And then finally, the individual capacity. Do I have the money? Do I have the time? Do I have the physical ability to do this? And so what all that means is that higher risk perception doesn't inherently lead to action. You do have to see the risk to think maybe I should do something, but that doesn't inherently mean you are going to do something. And the second narrative I want to talk about is Smokey has taught the public to think all fire is bad. And this is problematic from a number of angles. One is simply the evidence doesn't support it. Okay, now let's see. Now my computer is frozen. Okay, there we go. And the reality is that there's consistent evidence that the public actually has a good and very sophisticated understanding, often sophisticated understanding of fire ecology, that it has a beneficial role, and that it's not just good or bad. In fact, that kind of this binary dichotomy of good fire, bad fire, the only time I hear anybody talk about it, it's in the fire community. The public doesn't see it. They have a more nuanced view of it. And the other evidence that they have a more nuanced view is that 80% see prescribed fire as an acceptable management practice or appropriate tool. And that's in surveys across the country in a whole bunch of different locations. And that again shows that the public has kind of a more nuanced view of fire than this simple dichotomy. And the other problem with why, I like to defend the bear a little bit, because we've been telling people that fire is bad long before Smokey showed up. He came to be in 1944, and this is a marketing campaign from 1926, which I think does an even more serious job of suggesting that fire is bad. This is a Forest Service one from 1933. Again, Smokey's pretty benign compared to these ones. This is early World War II. Smokey did come out of World War II, but it's kind of like blaming the bear as a distraction because it's an easy thing to do. And it doesn't recognize that this is something that we've been doing for long before he came around. And the other reason why I think it's counterproductive is that when you ask the public, what did Smokey teach you? They will say, that I should be responsible when I'm in the woods, which I think is a really good message. And so by sort of saying Smokey taught the public to think all fire is bad, we're kind of undermining this really good message that he's giving. So I think that there's many reasons why we should not use that narrative. Another one is people don't take responsibility. And I'm hearing that a lot now of how do we get people to take personal responsibility? And that's problematic for a couple reasons. One is it's kind of based on the assumption people aren't taking responsibility. And the evidence is they are, and they see it as a shared responsibility. So they recognize I choose to live here. This is my property. It's my responsibility to mitigate risk on my property. And they recognize it's a sort of a shared risk. What happens on adjacent properties affects my risk. And that can make them more proactive and less proactive, so not a nice clean dynamic, but they recognize that we kind of all have to work together. And so when we say, how do we get them to take personal responsibility, we're overlooking the fact that most people are. And when you tell somebody you need to take responsibility and they feel like they are taking responsibility, that's a really good way to make them stop listening to you. And it's also kind of about guilt. And guilt is not a good motivator for people. And in terms of that shared responsibility, what do they kind of expect of government? Well, you take care of your land. So, don't tell us to take care of yours if you're not taking care of yours. Information, they would like information, but it's not this kind of generic, there's a risk and here's a defensible space diagram. It's on my property, what should I be worried about? Where's the fire likely to come from? What's the weather I need to pay attention to? Given my property, do I need to mitigate a little bit differently? Like, maybe more aggressively on that side where the fire is likely to come from. So it's more specific than this kind of generic approach. And then help with larger scale obstacles. Sometimes disposing of materials can be particularly important for places where either the vegetation grows back quickly or you need extra equipment to remove it. And also in communities where you have a lot of elderly who physically just can't do it. And then finally, we like to blame groups of people. It's all these new people who are moving in from urban areas and they don't know fire and they're less aware and they don't do anything. And there's no evidence that they're less aware or likely to mitigate their risk. In fact, the evidence suggests that if you had to pick one out, it's the newer people who are likely to be more proactive. And there's two reasons for this. One is 60% of moves in the United States are within the county. So those people are new to the street and maybe the neighborhood. They are not new to the fire risk. 20% of moves are from within the state, and then the other 20% is out of state or international. And it's kind of interesting to note is that particularly in the Western US, a lot of those out of state people outside California are coming from California where they've had more exposure to building codes for fire and vegetation management ordinances. And they often walk in and look around and like, why are we not doing something? And they're the ones who get their community on board. And that kind of relates to the other reason why new people aren't inherently the problem, which is confirmation bias. So these new people walk in and they're like, I'm new. How are things done here? What do we need to do? People who've lived there a long time are probably formed their opinion about what the fire risk and what needs to happen a long time ago, and they're not gonna go to meetings and they're not gonna pay attention to new brochures and stuff like that. We like to bring part-time residents. Again, no evidence that they're less likely to understand the risk. There's mixed evidence as to whether they're less likely to do something. Some find that there's no significant difference. Some studies find there is. But then it's not a knowledge thing. It's just simply about time. I'm here on my vacation. I'm not going to spend it mucking around in my vegetation. We also like to think, oh, once they experience a fire, well, then, then they're going to get on board. 30 plus years of natural hazards research and the fire research confirms it isn't consistent. Some people, it will absolutely be the aha moment. Other people will be the exact opposite of, hey, we're good. It's all burned down. Or that's so big, nasty, there's nothing we can do that would make a difference, so why bother? Most people, it sort of just affects them around the edges. It will make fire more salient to people, so they'll pay more attention to fire information, but how long that lasts is going to be very dependent. The rule of thumb is 3 months, but that's going to depend on like what else is going on in the world. So right now, I think it would probably last about 2 days. And then finally, basic demographic characteristics or regional differences. There's no evidence that education or income are associated with particular responses or beliefs or actions in relation to fire. and nor do we find regional differences in terms of the general responses. So people in the Southeast are, in their response to fire, are very similar to people in the West. It's just how they come together that leads things, and that kind of boils down to the local context. And that's what matters. That's where you see how these pieces come together and play out differently based on local fire history. So in the Southeast, they have to burn a lot because the vegetation grows back a lot. So they have a lot of experience with fire. So if it's more acceptable there, it's simply because they see it all the time. And that kind of gets to the three influential dynamics. And one of those is knowledge. The better understanding of a practice is associated with higher acceptance. So in the Southeast, they just have more exposure to fire. So they have better sort of understanding of the practice of prescribed burning. And so that's why they might be more accepting of it there, not because of a cultural distinction, but just because of better understanding. And the ecological nature of fire there means they have to burn all the time. And what's notable is actually fire risk is less important to people than the ecological benefits of a practice. So people are like, yes, they'll mitigate around their house for fire risk, and that is important, but equally important is, oh, I have way more deer. Oh, I see a lot more birds. So the ecological benefits really shape how people respond. And then whether or not local knowledge is taken into account is critical in how much attention they're going to pay to it. If they feel like this isn't applicable to me, the good way for them not to pay attention. It also is kind of a sign of respect that you've made the effort to recognize the local knowledge and the local context and what's really going on here and integrated that into what you're doing. The second one is trust. Do we trust the people who are giving us the information, and do we trust the people who are implementing the practice? And that really makes a difference in how people respond to both information and prescribed burning. And the third thing is interactive communication. And this is from 30+ years of social marketing research. How do we get people to wear seatbelts, stop smoking? That shows if you want to change behavior, you want to change social norms of what's appropriate behavior, interactive communication is critical. And it's particularly critical when you're asking for a more complex behavior change, which is what essentially fire mitigation is. We're asking for a fairly complex behavior change. And it's important because it helps with understanding. People can ask questions, they can clarify their misperceptions. You can clarify maybe your misperceptions of what the issue is. Oh, you're not worried about A, you're worried about B. Oh, well, then let's talk about how this can help with B. So it's basically just allows better understanding. And interactive communication helps facilitate trust. You can get to know each other, understand where somebody's coming from, and sort of get to know them. Ideally, you have time to sort of interact and build trust over time, but if you don't, particularly during a fire, then transparency is really critical because it's kind of a rule of thumb, a heuristic for trust. I don't have time to really assess if this person is trustworthy, but they're being straight with me, they're giving good information, they're not kind of trying to bamboozle me into something, and so I can trust the information they're giving me. And so that's really critical. So sort of the model that we have initially is if they get the fire risk, then they're going to do something. Well, that matters, but more important is, do they understand how this reduces risk, the ecological benefits? Concerns do come into play, but those can be moderated by understanding. So the more people understand the ecological benefits of prescribed fire, the less concern they have about escape and smoke. Trust, are they credible? Are they competent? And then the communication process. Is it interactive? Is it transparent? And then to add on top of that, some other findings that we get from the larger natural hazards field, which has been looking since the 1930s on why do individuals choose to take protective action. Key variables are how effective is the action in protecting them? Is it worth the effort of my doing this? And then I've already talked about, do I have the ability to do it? Do I have the time and the money? And then what I haven't talked about is how does this fit in the rest of my life? People are not just care about fire, it's also their everyday life, the other values, the other things they care about. Fire is just one of many considerations. Psychologists have this idea of a finite pool of worries, which is that humans can only worry about so many things at any given moment in time. And so when you have a fire gets into that pool of worries, it becomes salient, but over time, other things are going to slosh it out of the pool. And I think right now with COVID, our pool of worries is extremely full already. So trying to add fire in there is probably not going to work that well. But what you can do is look at these competing and complementary values. So like, are there competing ways? You know, people won't remove vegetation because of concerns about erosion. So that's a competing one. But complementary activities, the more, if you have all these things in your life and you can check off 5 boxes with one activity, then you're more likely to do it. So if the vegetation also helps with something else that, you know, or changing your roof is good for snow and it's good for wind and it's good for fire, that gives you even more incentives to change your roof. So the complementary activities, I think, is a really critical place. So kind of what's the answer to that question I had at the beginning, or the solution? Homeowners just need to be aware of their risks so they'll fix their mess. Well, hopefully by now you know that this illustration is way too simplistic. That's basically an illustration of that statement. Information about the risk, they will act. Well, information about the risk will help them consider action. It will provide them with knowledge about possible mitigation measures. It will help them understand the level of fire risk. But other personal characteristics come into play: risk tolerance, their experience, the social norms. But this is where we tend to focus all of our interaction with people. It's all on this information dissemination part of the equation. And the problem is that it doesn't inherently lead to taking action. It can lead to considering taking action, but that means they just go into a trade-off analysis. So all these different variables I've been talking about, how do they add up? Do they add up to a plus, or do they add up to a minus? If it's a plus, then, well, yeah, I will do something. But if they add up to a negative, then I'm not going to bother. So I think the trick is to look at the trade-off analysis and where do we have leverage points? Where can we shift the balance into acting? With COVID, I think the thing to think about is, how can these actions increase their sense of control or reduce their uncertainty in some way? So we have COVID, we have wildfire season. Wildfire season creates some additional uncertainty. So how can your actions reduce it? Well, you know, why don't you get your evacuation plan in order now? You know, talk it over with your family, figure out where you're gonna go, have your to-go bag ready. And so then, you know, if there is a fire in your area, that's just one less thing to worry about because you've already got the plan in place. And you can do similar arguments with mitigation. You know, there are actions that people can take. There's not a lot we can do to control COVID, but there are actions we can do to control our level of exposure for fire and reduce uncertainty around that. During fires, these key variables become even more critical because during an event, as we know now, uncertainty is heightened, and that heightens the dynamics, that heightens the need to understand what's going on, it heightens the need to trust the people giving you the information, it heightens the need to be able to ask questions. And that's been shown in fire research during fire studies. One example is, you know, a study that showed that evacuees place much higher value on interactive communication than people who have not had to evacuate. Evacuees, much more uncertain situation, they want the chance to ask questions and clarify. And transparent communication becomes especially important now because transparent communication reduces uncertainty. Oh, they've told me really clearly what's going on. They've told me what they do know. They've told me what they don't know. I know a little bit more now. If it's not transparent communication, what you've actually done is you've increased uncertainty. I don't think what they're telling me is true, so now I have to go someplace else and look for more information. So transparent communication is particularly critical. And then a final comment with COVID and smoke is, you've heard last week about sort of what the fire services are doing to sort of deal with COVID and fire response. And then sort of one of the things we tend to focus on, how do we get people to mitigate during fire, COVID and wildfire? But to me, actually the big question is smoke. And smoke exacerbates respiratory issues. COVID is a respiratory infection. There is evidence that if you increased air pollution, increased susceptibility to COVID and increases your symptoms from COVID. And there's also evidence that it increases the length of recovery if you have had COVID. So the smoke from wildfires is always an issue, but this year it's a particular issue. But we do have ways to reduce uncertainty. So there's some frequently asked questions that have come out with CDC and the Forest Service. At the end, I'll give you a link to this that sort of give you some actions you can take now ahead of time. And I wanted to highlight one of them, which is this clean airspace. So if you have a issue like asthma or COPD where you're more at risk, then you can plan ahead. Make sure that if you have an air conditioning system, you have a brand new HEPA filter on it. If you don't have air conditioning, then make sure you have a portable air cleaner that you can put into a room and create a clean room. And get it now while they're not all back ordered. And this does reduce uncertainty. And I'm an example. As soon as I learned this, I have asthma. I went out and I bought an air cleaner. So now I have a room where it is. And now I just feel much better that if there's a fire in the area and there's smoke, I know that that's something I'm not going to have to worry as much about. So useful thing, a way that you can help people reduce uncertainty. And then I'm very quickly going to go over the wild and urban interface topic. That second question about wild and urban interface planning will solve all problems. And really interesting to me is we have sort of this narrative about the problem and what the problem is. We're having more social impacts because of climate change, because of fuels buildup from suppression, and because of the expanding wild and urban interface. Now, what's really interesting or frustrating is that we have tons of data about how climate change is getting worse because of or fires getting worse because of climate change, and how fuels buildup has led to increased issues with fire. We don't actually have a lot of data about how the expanding wild and urban interface is leading to growing social impacts, or why, or where, or how. So the kind of simplified version is we need to limit or control development in fire-prone areas. Well, what evidence do we have that this would help us? Well, we do have really solid data that the WUI is expanding nationally. And by the way, the WUI is sort of almost by definition going to expand because the WUI is where houses intermingle with natural areas. So short of everybody living in already developed urban areas, high rises, I guess, we're going to have an expanding WUI if our population grows. We have fairly solid data on individual structural weaknesses. What makes a house susceptible to, more likely to ignite from a fire? So we have pretty good data on that. But we really have very minimal data on how the WUI expansion is affecting our losses and costs. And we have very little data on what type of land use planning. So we keep saying we need better land use planning, but we don't actually have data showing what that looks like. What type of land use planning will decrease risk? And will the same type of land use planning decrease risk in all different types of fire regimes and ecosystems? We don't have data on that. And when we do have data that gets cited, it's often very minimal and problematic. And I'm just going to touch on two of those that are really common. One of them is this sort of statement that firefighting costs are going up because of the WUI. And the common one that you see in papers is the estimate of 50 to 95% increase because of protection of private property. And you might see this statement with like 5 citations after it, but if you actually follow them, they all basically lead back to one single study, which was a 2006 Office of Inspector General report that asked fire managers to estimate what was contributing to costs. And there's a good incentive to point your finger to those people, the WUI. So it's very problematic data. There are some studies that kind of have taken a more nuanced and rigorous look at this relationship. And they do find there's a positive association between increased housing and suppression costs, but they don't demonstrate causality. So we don't know how that housing is increasing costs. None find an influence even close to the lower limit of the 50 to 95%. And they all found other factors that also influence cost. But we just tend to focus on the expanding WUI as the problem. So that's kind of leading us down the road of focusing a solution that may not actually be what's contributing to that particular problem. And then the other one is I tend to think of this as a chicken little narrative, which is only 16% of the WUI is currently developed. And again, you might see an article that references 16% or the inverse, 84% is available. But it all goes back to one study in 2008 that only looked at the Western US. And by the way, most of the WUI in the United States is in the Eastern US. And it uses a very non-traditional definition of the wild and urban interface, which was just land within 500 meters of forested public land. Now in California, any of you who've been up to the Sierra Nevada and the National Forest, I bet you can think of a lot of 500-meter land along the edge of the National Forest that is not developable, has no access, has no water, is too steep terrain to put anything in. And so that's sort of this statement about 84% is undeveloped is kind of, it's more of a sky is falling statement than something that's actually really about the problem, because it's not looking at the desirability of development. It doesn't take into account whether there's actual fire risk on those 500 meters. I think there's significant places where the fire risk is not that high. And it doesn't take into the fact that we actually do know how to build homes that are fire resistant. So it's not inherent that the WUI will contribute to increased fire risk, or at least at the level that they treat it. So these two solutions that we have, homeowners understand their risk and fix their problem. Well, we have good evidence that actually they can do a lot to mitigate their risk. There's really good evidence of the effectiveness of the 30 meters of vegetation management around the home, of things you can do to increase your spectral ignition resistance. We have good evidence about the factors that influence homeowner actions. And so the clear kind of takeaway from that for me is it's a much more complex problem than simply just about risk perception. And if you just focus on risk perception, then you're probably not going to get very far down the road. And then this idea that we need to just limit or control development in fire-prone areas, there's little data about what type of land use planning actually will decrease risk or decrease cost. The effectiveness might actually depend on what risk you're trying to mitigate. So if you're trying to decrease cost, a lot of the papers that look at this recommend clustered housing, because then you have a smaller area for people to protect, and resources need to protect. But if you're trying to decrease home loss, well, then cluster development might just increase ignition, house-to-house ignition. When we have our major home loss events, it's when the homes are close together. So that might not be the best recommendation, but we don't know. We just don't know how the data. And I think my fundamental issue with it really ignores the non-fire context. Development happens for a lot of reasons other than fire. If you limited fire-prone development in California, I think that means people could only live in the Central Valley or the Mojave and maybe Northeast and extreme Northwest California. And so that's kind of ignoring the larger dynamics, and ignores, like, people should, I think, be able to live in nature if that's what they want. We shouldn't make everybody live in a city. Affordability, this may be where people can afford to live, or it may be where their jobs are. And sort of related to that is a final issue about equity. When you limit or try to control development too much, I'm all for building codes, but when you try to sort of say you can't build here or there, or we need to increase insurance rates, what you're in essence doing is creating equity issues, because the wealthy will always be able to self-insure or purchase property where they can build, and those sorts of things. And I think those are really important things for us to be thinking about when we think about the fire problem. And then I just want to end by sort of taking that one step further to sort of, is part of the issue we're taking an approach to fire management just too simplistic overall? And this kind of comes out of conversations in a book chapter that I worked on with some colleagues in Europe, in which we sort of said, what does the current system look like, and what do we want it to look like? And we sort of argue that historically what we've approached fire management from a war on fire kind of paradigm. And we think you can not just live with fire, but you can thrive with fire. And so this is a graph of sort of the initial approach to fire in 1910. It's basically entirely focused on firefighting activities and maybe some after fire reporting and what caused it. And then over time, we've sort of integrated more activities before a fire, which is kind of that yellow-green, infrastructure and planning, risk assessment. But still, the majority of this is still a war on fire. The majority of activity and resources go into things to fight the fire. And we would argue that we need to move to what we call a shared wildfire governance model. And in this one, where you see most of the activities happen, it's in the yellow-green on my monitor section, which is all actions that you take before a fire. And there's a fair number of activities you take after a fire to try to ensure that you recover in a better and healthier manner, more resilient manner. And in this one, less than a quarter of the activities are actually in the fire response. And a different way of looking at it is, this is sort of the same graph, but with the individual activities lined out. And the red arrows kind of show all of the wildfire response activities that we've always kind of done and focused on. And then over time, we've added in a lot more activities that are focused on managing the fuels and the vegetation and that sort of thing. And then the purple ones, arrows, are activities that more around the social. And these are kind of the social activities that we have kind of been dealing with for a while, about evacuation and raising awareness and these sorts of things. But what you see is these are all the social activities we need to be looking at and paying attention to if we really want to shift from fighting fires all the time to actually really living and potentially thriving with fire. So to summarize, we need to continually assess our notion of the imagined public with empirical reality. What does the data say? Communication is critical, constant, interactive, transparent. Transparency particularly critical when things are highly uncertain. I didn't talk about it much, but knowing about the planning and thinking behind decisions is actually really important to the public, and that increases their tolerance and acceptance of decisions. Risk independence, let's not talk about shifting responsibility, but about shared responsibility and partnerships. We're all in this together. How can we help each other? Listening, taking local context into account helps. And improved outcomes are more likely when we treat the social with the same level of attention and rigor as we apply to the biophysical. And that's kind of what my last graph was to show you, that we paid a lot of attention to the biophysical, and there's a whole mess of the social that we need to be paying attention to if we want to actually have better outcomes. And then finally, think outside the fire vacuum. If we look at how fire fits into the greater society and other issues, I think we're going to have long-term better outcomes overall. And finally, if you want information to read about anything I've talked about, a lot of what I've talked about in terms of the homeowners, you can find in these GTRs, which you can download from Tree Search. If you don't know about Tree Search, great resource. Any Forest Service publication can be downloaded for free, or any Forest Service research publication can be downloaded for free from Tree Search. And then if you want the information about the FAQ worksheets about COVID and smoke, these are different sites you can get from the AFI website or from the CDC. And I only went over by a little.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was great. At this point, we're going to open it up for audience Q&A. And so if you can see down at the bottom of your screen, there should be a Q&A box. For everybody who has a question, feel free to open that up and go ahead and type up your questions. And at this point, Sarah, we can go back to seeing your full face and out of screen share. Perfect. So we had a question that just came in asking about what cities or programs have been most successful in solving the social science issues of home mitigation.
There's a lot of very good programs out there. I think the Living with Fire in Nevada has done a great job. They've been at it probably longer than most. Fire Safe Councils in California can do a really good job. The Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network has a lot to offer fire-wise. They all have something to offer. The key is you really do have to understand your community and figure out what's going to work best for your community, because not every community is going to be the same. Some communities, like we do have a tendency to focus on, we need to have programs that get all the neighbors together to work together. And that's a great network, and that can be very effective in communities where the neighbors actually want to talk to each other. But there's a lot of communities in fire-prone areas where they've moved there kind of to be left alone, and their definition of a good neighbor is, I help you if you need help, and you help me if I need help, and otherwise we leave each other alone, in which case you might want a really different program. So there's a lot of very good programs out there, and you can sort of find information about them from probably the Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network is the place I would start. But there's a lot of really good programs. Incline Village has done a fantastic job. In fact, you know, that picture I had at the very beginning of the flames, that's actually a prescribed burn in Incline Village that, you know, all the dots are houses worth millions of dollars and nobody complained. And in fact, homeowners there complain when they don't do prescribed burning. They say, you're not getting enough smoke into my house. So they've done a really good job of helping their community understand the risk and work with them and understand why they're trying to do what they're doing. But there's a lot of amazing stuff happening in different communities. And the key is really to figure out your community and what its needs are and what approach is going to work.
We have another question asking about the term transparent communication and whether you could elaborate a little more about what that means.
So transparent communication, just I guess another way of putting it is you're just really upfront. You don't tell it like it is. And if you don't know information, say, I don't know. Oftentimes what people tend to do with fire, at least that I've seen, is they kind of want to soften the edge. We've got it under control, right? That's not really transparent. That really doesn't tell anything. It's just saying, trust us. Transparent communication would be, you know, we see that the fire's coming in, we're expecting the wind to increase. We feel that we have sufficient resources, but we don't know this. So it's sort of saying exactly what you know and what you don't know, and not sort of beating around the bush or trying to soft pedal anything.
There's been some research coming out of Stanford looking at the individual, or rather, there's been research in general about individual decision making, but the social costs of wildfires are highly problematic in California, with $30 billion in PG&E liability, long-term consequences on health, and probably impacts on funding for the state carbon mitigation plans. Are these good reasons to limit growth in WUI areas? Are there good reasons to limit growth in WUI areas? Can you elaborate?
I think my answer should be that I don't know the answer to that question without having a better sense of how limiting growth will improve outcomes for fire. So we do have a good sense of how to build your house, so building codes. We do have a good sense that there might be specific locations on a property that are worse than others. But we don't have a good sense as to, like, what's the right property size? Is 40 acres, is 1 acre? You know, that might depend on the ecosystem. In Ponderosa Pine, where if it's an appropriate landscape, it's low-level fires where the homeowner can basically, if they manage their property, control their fire risk pretty well. You might want larger parcels. If it's lodgepole pine, you might want smaller parcels because, you know, it's. So I think the question about limiting WUI development, it's also more complicated, right? In California, you have totally seen this. So Santa Rosa allowed more structures to be built after the Tubbs fire because they have a housing crunch and they have a housing affordability crunch. So if you limit the development, you're limiting people's ability to have a home. And there's been similar issues that, from what I've seen, about Paradise. If you sort of try to limit those, that Paradise was a place where people who didn't have a lot of money could afford to retire. So there's really interesting questions there around, like, you know, how will the upgrades increase the cost of homes? Will they still be able to live there? And if you completely banned living there, where does everybody go? And when you send people to outside of an area and large amounts of people, they're probably just being displaced to a different hazard, particularly in California, where, you know, there's hazards galore in California. So I think the bigger question for the development question is that thinking outside the vacuum. Like, what are all the reasons why this area needs to be developed? And rather than this sort of binary, don't let them live there or let them live there, how can we let them live there in a way that's going to mitigate the risk as much as possible? So I think I would make it a more complex conversation than just simply let's limit development as to, okay, if we're going to talk about limiting development, what does that look like and how does that affect other values?
Thanks. Could you give us an example of integrating a local context into a communication plan, or a time when something important was omitted?
Not necessarily for something important, but a good example of something, or sort of the local context, is when people have brochures and they've borrowed it from someplace else. And I'm all for borrowing good communication documents from elsewhere, but they didn't update the pictures for the local situation. And so people just immediately were like, that's Florida. That's not California. That's not applicable to me. The instructions were all still applicable, but they just looked at the picture and were like, that's not us. And then, so that's part of integrating local context, is, you know, recognizing in this area, the way we build our homes means that we need to be particular attention. In Southern California, we pay particular attention to the fact everybody has Spanish roofs, which you might feel is safer, but if you don't close the vents at the end, you can actually increase your fire risk. So it's kind of really understanding what the dynamic in your area is and tailoring the generic information to fit the conditions of the local.
Do you think that we need new institutions or funding at the state and federal level to help us live with fire? And how do we keep new funds devoted to fire from getting sucked into suppression-oriented efforts?
Oh, what is it? That's the $2 billion question. I feel like, so I've done some work in Australia, and one of the things that I really find intriguing about Australia is their institutional structure is much simpler than in the United States. So every state or territory has only 2 or 3 fire agencies. So that means for the entire country, there's probably 20 fire agencies, which means that any change in policy only needs to be coordinated amongst those 20. Now in California, if you count the federal fire agencies, the county, the municipal, the volunteer fire departments, there's probably over 1,000 fire agencies, which makes it very complicated to change things. So that leaves me sort of very leery about the notion of creating more institutions. I think I keep seeing these new centers and other things pop up, and I think it would be much better, or in programs, we like to create new programs. I think it would be better to take the programs we already have, identify the ones that are working pretty well, and if there's something missing, add on to them, or, improve that part of them as opposed to trying to create a whole nother institutional structure on top or beside or around what already exists. I'm for simplifying rather than adding to the complexity. And as to that $2 billion question, that's always the really hard part. Humans are very good about reacting, and the challenge always with mitigation is you're asking people to invest money in something to maintain their current lifestyle if something goes wrong. And that if something goes wrong may never ever happen. So that's the challenge with mitigation is it's very easy to just sort of say, well, we don't know, why should we invest money when we don't know that we're going to get a return on investment? Whereas when there is a fire, there's a very good incentive to put money into it. So that's kind of the continual challenge we have. But if we could get to a place where communities are comfortable enough with fire and prepared enough and are fire adapted enough, then I think you could get to a place where the demands for fire suppression might not be as big. I always default to a homeowner who asked me how I define fire adapted communities, and I told her my answer, and then I asked her what her definition was, and she said, it's a community where we've done what we need to, so fire is just another weather event. And I think that boils down to it. If we can see fire as not a disaster or something we have to respond to, but something where we're like, okay, that's well managed and we're good, and we just need to make sure that it, doesn't go there, then we don't need to have quite as dramatic a response. But then we have to hit all those purple arrows that I showed at the very end.
It's a little complicated.
It is very complicated.
Are there any research efforts or outreach efforts around lower income communities or communities of color? From this person, so many of the FireWise efforts I've seen have been middle or upper class and white neighborhoods.
Yeah, and that is definitely one of the problems with some of the programs, is that they do tend to sort of depend on communities that are already kind of people who have a lot of time on their hands and used to have jobs where they were like, CEOs and are good at organizing. There is not tons of research that has kind of looked explicitly at those communities, but there are projects that have had a range of income levels involved. And I'm thinking specifically of one where we actually looked at 3 communities that were on all night right next to each other. And when the developer sold the land, he set up a lower income, a middle income, and a wealthy income community. And we didn't end up looking at the wealthy income community, but we looked at the middle and low income communities. And we found that they both ended up doing a lot of mitigation. They just used different tools. So the middle income had a homeowners association that could kind of enforce people doing stuff and provide incentives and maintain the other space. And the lower income community ended up doing a lot more sort of group activities and people working together to get the work done on everybody's property. So there's a lot. There was another program that was in northern Idaho. It was poor, people needed work, so they used their money to train contractors to go door to door and say, hi, would you like free defensible space? So they created jobs, and these people who really didn't have the resources, have the tools to take out all the vegetation, had somebody come do it for them. And we went back and looked at them 3 years later, and they had all maintained. They were just like, we just didn't have the resources to actually start. So there are a lot of programs out there that have sort of addressed and figured out how to work within the context of their community. So yes, there is a unfortunate tendency sort of to default to the wealthier community that are already well-resourced, but there is a lot of amazing stuff happening in less well-to-do communities.
We have a couple questions here related to the WUI development issue, including questions about people's right to build housing in forested areas and the trade-offs of destroying the environment due to housing development, as well as some of the costs related to fighting wildfires and how the nature of the response to large wildfires has changed regarding public safety power shutoffs and evacuations and other factors. Can you talk a little bit about some of the costs or trade-offs and what might be worth it or not for WUI development?
Well, I'm not really sure I can talk to the costs or the trade-off or how things have changed, but I think a lot of my final point about think outside the fire vacuum is a reflection, comes out of having, out of those very questions. So for instance, the power shutoff is kind of, yeah, that's not a minor thing. And it's done looking at the world through the lens of fire. We're going to shut off to prevent future fires. But it doesn't step out and say, what else is going on in these communities where they might need electricity? And sort of doesn't look at the collateral consequences to people who have medical conditions and all those sorts of things. So I think we would do a better job having a solution if we kind of recognized that we need to look at this wide spectrum of you know, not just fire, but how does this action for fire affect other things? And in terms of like the trade-off in development and where people live, I think those are really important questions to be asking. And we do need to pay attention to the impact on the environment. And landscape fragmentation is really something we need to pay attention to. My concern is when we frame it all as being about fire, when really fundamentally we're talking about something bigger. So I have seen a number of cases. There was a case down in San Diego where real fundamentally this community, this one group just did not want this development going in, period. They just didn't want it to happen. But they used fire risk as how they argued against it. So fire is a really easy way for people to say, no, this should not happen. But really what people are talking about is we don't want that land developed. And I think that's a really good argument, but then have that argument. Don't have the argument that it's because of the fire risk. Have the argument about we don't want more landscape fragmentation because that messes up, you know, wildlife corridors and it introduces this and X and Y and it adds to the fire risk. But we tend to end up framing up using fire as this really convenient proxy for other arguments. And so I think we just need to make it explicit to really have a good discussion about, you know, are we talking about fire? Are we really talking about, I just don't want development?
We also have a few questions about prescribed burning, particularly which region of the country is more effective and is there data on that? And then also on the messaging of prescribed burns, if a high percentage of the general public is in favor of prescribed burns, has there been research on how messaging for prescribed burns should change or expand? And who should those trusted messengers be?
Okay, you may have to remind me of parts of that. I'll start with the messaging. So there has been research, not like explicit messaging research per se, but there's a lot of research about social acceptance of prescribed fire. And that tells you something about like the messaging and what you need to be telling people. So people are much more okay with prescribed burning when they understand the ecological benefits of fire. And when they understand, when they have confidence in the people who are implementing the practice, and when they understand the amount of planning that has gone into prescribed fire. So it's not just a casual, oh, today's a nice day, let's go burn. And so that tells you that, you know, what your messaging needs to be is talking about, here's, you know, not just getting obsessed with prescribed fire helps us reduce fire risk. That's valid, but we're doing this burn because it improves the bighorn sheep habitat here, and we've been planning this burn for 2 years. Here's the conditions in which, you know, we've assessed which conditions are most likely to work. We've got it very well staffed. Our staff has really good training, and where you've actually, the other key part, so that's part of the messaging. And the other part is doing this all way before there ever is a prescribed burn. Because a lot of what people want is not necessarily the acceptance or not. They just want to know that, you know, they're there and they have an opinion and they have concerns. And so when you go and you talk to people ahead of time, you're sort of saying, hey, I know this might affect you, and so we want to check in and see what you think. They've started doing a lot more burning in northern Colorado, and when I first was talking to the people, the forest who wanted to do it, they were like, oh, you got to give us a brochure to hand to people, you know, so that when we go talk to them about prescribed fire, they'll, you know, that explains it. And I was like, they will be fine. Just go talk to them. They'll be so happy you went out and you talked to them. And they were like very leery of that. And they came, next time I came back, and they had this huge smile on their face, and they were just like, you're right. They didn't hate us. They just were really happy we were asking them questions. They're not against prescribed burning, but they wanted to know what was going on and what we were doing and why we were doing it. So the sort of default thing I have about messaging is tell people who you are, what you're doing, and why you're doing it. And you'll probably be fine. In terms of areas of the country that are doing better at prescribed fire than others, that's a tricky question, because what does better mean? More? Less controversial? So the Southeast does do a lot of burning, but they kind of have to. If you've ever been down there, their vegetation, if you don't burn every 2 or 3 years, you're, you know, and their vegetation is also has like the parameters of being able to burn is because the humidity there makes it a lot easier to burn in you know, the marginal condition window is much wider. So they do a lot more burning there, and they do in Florida. They've done some great messaging with the public. They really work with their public. They will shut down a burn if they think smoke's going to get into a community, even if it's a burn that they've like been planning for years, because they're like, no, because, you know, if I let smoke get into that community now, it's going to mess up my program for 5 years. Whereas if I shut it down now, they're going to trust me that I'm looking after them, and I'll be able to keep burning. And actually Northern California up with the Hoopa and the Crook and the Yurok are doing some amazing things, working with the national forests and the national parks, and doing some really interesting cultural burning up there. They're doing a great job. So those are a couple places that have been, you know, really getting some fire in the ground. And there's a lot of other places out there. The Southwest region, Coconino, the Kaibab, are all doing a lot of burning. So they're all doing a good job. And a key part of it is that they are doing that outreach ahead of time to help people understand what's going on and why.
Great. I don't necessarily want to keep you too long, Sarah, because we're running on about 15 minutes later.
Yeah, I am good until the half hour, but we can also stop sooner if there's.
Okay. So we have a fairly long question talking about a subdivision with a lot of small lots, and but only about a quarter of the lots seem to have homes, with a lot of vacant lot owners not maintaining vegetation. The subdivision has tried abatement and placing liens, but property owners are abandoning these unbuildable lots. Plus there's a water moratorium for new development. Have you seen other areas with absentee landowners? How do jurisdictions deal with this? Nuisance ordinances, condemning abandoned plots? What can happen here?
Yes, that sounds like quite a complicated community. Yes, absentee landowners are like, so I do say that new part-time residents are not an issue really. Absentee landowners are different, and yes, those do tend to be more problematic properties because they don't have incentives to manage the property. There are places who do have nuisance laws and will, you know, contact the owner. And what they actually say, they've said is when we contact the owner and say, we're going to do the work and charge you, the homeowner, the owner's usually like, great, go for it, please do. So a lot of times it's just, they have to put that effort into telling the, and sometimes they don't even have to threaten that we're going to do it and you're going to charge you. They're like, hey, we need this lot mitigated and we can do it for you and charge you if you want. And they're usually, yes, please. Not usually, but they will do that. There was another community, which was a smaller one, in which kind of had this, the head of the, just a woman in the community who just decided, we are going to be fire safe. And she just pestered the absentee owners until they agreed to let her crew go in and mitigate for them. So it's not easy by any shape of the form. I think that is probably one of the bigger challenges, are absentee lots. But it also kind of, your point about like they're abandoning lots that aren't buildable is kind of raises one of the other arguments you often see in some places, and including Australia, where like we should buy back properties in fire-prone areas. The challenge there is that only helps if you're going to be able to manage the risk on the property by whomever buys it back. So, and we know about how well-resourced agencies are in terms of managing their land. So, you know, it seems nice because you're removing the potential of a house going on there, but it doesn't necessarily mitigate your fire risk. Hopefully that touched on enough of the challenges that it sounds like that.
There were quite a few. We have another question about, under what conditions does clustered housing actually provide wildfire safety?
I cannot answer that question. And that's just simply, I mean, I think there might be a few people who could give you, like Steve Quarles could give you probably a much better answer than I could. But we just don't have that much research that explicitly looks at how different development patterns lead to better or worse outcomes.
Are there studies then on alternative housing materials withstanding wildfires?
Yeah, so there is some really good work. Again, I couldn't tell you the answers, but the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety has done some really great research looking at materials and like how you build your house and eaves and, you know, corners, and where they actually have this facility where they can build a life-size replica of a home and then send an ember shower on it and videotape and see where the embers hang out and catch the house on fire. I recommend Googling that. So they actually are looking at like what materials and what kind of deck materials are more likely to catch on fire and not. And they are looking at all of that. And I know they have fact sheets on a lot of that stuff, but I cannot tell you what the materials are.
Okay. Are there effective public-private partnership models that provide wildfire mitigation or home hardening incentives? And is there an element of insurance scarcity that might be influencing public policy for mandates and fines? So talking a little bit about carrots and sticks. And then adding on to that, is there a way through these carrots and sticks plus education to cut through some of the false narratives that you described?
Well, one false narrative is that insurance is a solution. So often there's a thing about insurance as a stick, and it's not actually a stick. And that's not the function of insurance. Insurance is meant to bear and share the risk. And it's not meant as a tool to get people to do something. And that's not how the insurance industry sees its role. Its role is really about their own risk management. They do see themselves as one more educational tool. But the notion that like we could raise the rates to get people to do stuff, or we could give them, you know, bonuses, the actually economics of that is incredibly complicated because insurance is highly regulated. So there's like, there's a public, I don't know if you'd call the FireWise relationship it has with insurance companies where they give a discount to FireWise communities. But that's $50 a year, which, is more, token than it is actually going to be an incentive to people. And then the other problem with insurance as a stick is that, again, you get into the equity issues of, wealthy people can always afford higher insurance rates. So then people who are already lower income and don't have much money, you're making them even more vulnerable by not allowing them to have insurance. And sometimes they're living where they're living because that's where they can afford to live. So we're kind of piling on to people who are already disadvantaged. And another consequence of that is that a lot of times the people who don't have insurance, they're the ones who are going to stay and defend, which, we can have a debate as to whether or not that's a good idea, but that is a potential consequence. And what else do I need to answer in that one, Rebecca?
I think you talked about it. I think it was a pretty serious question.
It was a very serious.
I mean, it was just about false narratives and that you were describing. But.
Yeah, and I think the key with false narratives is more just that imagined public point. If you hear a narrative, go say, okay, everybody in the room is saying new people are the problem. Let's go find out what the data says. And I actually got on this narrative idea because when I started my dissertation, I bought into the Smokey Bear has taught the public to think all fire is bad. That's what all the fire people told me. I'm like, all right, I believe it. I wrote it up. My dissertation advisor said, where's your proof? And I was like, and I went and looked, and lo and behold, there were no studies that demonstrated that Smokey had taught the public to think all fire was bad. And so I think that's the key with narratives, is to just not accept them on face value and say, what is the evidence for this narrative, and why is it sticking? So, what purpose does the narrative serve is also kind of a useful question to ask, because narratives leads to specific solutions. And so oftentimes interest groups this is kind of getting off the fire topic, but narratives can be used to frame a problem to get to the solution you want. So it can also be helpful to be like, why is this narrative useful? And who is it useful to? So I think the way you get around false narratives is just to be aware of narratives and then look at what they're based on and what the evidence supporting them is. And there are narratives that are based on evidence.
Somewhat related to the last question, we have questions about financial incentives, whether insurance or otherwise, that can motivate people to do something. And so what's the role of financial incentives in mitigating fire risk?
That's a really interesting one, because a lot of studies find that actually people don't, when you ask them like, would this help you do the work, how much would you need? People don't actually really, the incentive is more symbolic to a lot of people in terms of financial incentives. And ironically, some programs, if I recall correctly, have found that the people most likely to take advantage of financial incentives are the more well-to-do. Whereas the less well-to-do will just be like, well, we're going to figure out how to do this on our own. So there's a whole bunch of like complexity around sort of who takes advantage of incentives and who doesn't. I personally think that when we think about financial incentives, the better way to think about it is not like, yes, there might be individual incentives, like FEMA has a program that helps people pay for people to replace their roofs, which is great because that can be very expensive. And if you want to speed up their doing it sooner, that can make a difference. But I think the financial incentives can actually be more effective when you use the money you have to provide services or something that help people overcome a barrier. So providing a chipping program, or providing a crew that will come and take away all the vegetation, or paying the contractors to go door to door and say, hi, do you want defensible space? Those were all programs where they weren't necessarily giving a financial incentive directly to the person, but they were ending up using the finances to provide a service that overcame a barrier for people. So I think it's being creative with how you think about what is an incentive.
So we have 2 questions left for you from our audience.
Good, that's perfect timing.
The first one is regarding structure hardening. People have said to me, your suggestions are fine. You can't force me to do any of that. My response has evolved to, and I can't force firefighters to come protect your unprepared homes. Would you suggest that this is a fair trade-off discussion point?
No. I don't think you get far by sort of that fear or that threatening approach. It's kind of, that creates an adversarial relationship, that sort of dichotomy I was talking about earlier. And in general, that just is going to make people shut down and stop listening. Like, well, why should I pay attention to you with that attitude, right? And plus, you know what, even if they do harden your home, you can't guarantee, I mean, no matter what you do, you can't force firefighters to go protect that home, whether it's hardened or not. So it's more about, yeah, I can't force you to do it, but here's why you might want to do it. It will help, depending on what it is. I like changing a roof, I get it, it's expensive. And so, just say, hey, here's all the benefits to changing your roof. And I understand you might not be able to afford to do it now, but the sooner you do it, the more years you're going to have when you have more confidence your house will survive a fire if there's an area, or the fewer years you'll have of worrying if there's a fire. And then the complementary activities, yes, it will cost you a bit to manage your vegetation, but you're going to get to see more deer around, and it'll increase your property value, because I think there is a study that shows that. But sort of more showing, and there's some really simple things. Okay, so maybe that's too big for you right now. There's some really simple things that will make a difference. Like if you screen your vents, that actually can make a huge difference in the likelihood that your house is going to catch on fire. So it's kind of not about forcing people, but finding the incentives and the reasons. So some of that is figuring out what reason works for each person, because everybody cares about different things. And some people it might be the nature, some people it might be the cost, some people it might be the worry. So that's why the interactive communication is really critical, because it allows you time to figure out what that person really cares about, and then frame it honestly, not manipulatively, but frame it at, address the problem in terms of what they care about.
Thank you. And then our very last question. Are there any wildfire initiatives to protect or prevent harm to homeless people and undocumented farm workers in California in the event of a wildfire or smoke exposure?
I do not know. I don't know what's going on in California enough. That's a really good question. In terms of the smoke exposure, that would be, I think the public health people are doing a lot of thinking in terms of COVID and what they need to do to help the homeless people in that respect. And I think the public health people are pretty aware of the smoke part of it. So I think there are discussions along those lines, whether or not they're happening in California. I've heard them in other states, I think, but I can't speak to California. And I think, yeah, the homeless is I am not aware, but that does not mean that there are not fire departments that are not dealing with, that don't have programs for that. And that's another tricky one, right? Because helping and working with the homeless is much bigger than just fire. So if you have a program that's really doing a great job of getting the homeless taken care of, finding them housing, and you're doing it for reasons that have nothing whatsoever to do with fire, you're at the same time, you're addressing that fire risk for those groups. So, there are a lot of really great programs across the country that are working to help, the homeless find homes or, be less at risk. And those have collateral benefits as opposed to damage that might have to do with fire. But I'm not aware of a specific program on it. I think that's an interesting question.
For your next research. Thank you so much, Sarah. It was, as always, such a pleasure to chat with you, and I'm sure everyone in our audience truly appreciates all the work and the research that you've been doing. I think everyone's giving a virtual round of applause to you, Sarah. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys, and thank you for such great questions. Those were really interesting ones, and thanks for bearing with my technological challenges and for helping me fix them.
Always, always, always. Thanks so much.
All right.